Okay, well, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity of talking to Professor Sen. And this program is going out to the conference being held in Jakarta, and we're looking forward very much to what he has to say on issues relevant to the conference theme.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. Well, we are both sad that we are not actually there in Jakarta, and I wish I could be there. I send my greetings, and Tony's too, I'm sure, to all the participants in Jakarta who are fortunate to be in the meeting. Unfortunately, I'll be teaching a class by then. But it's very kind of the organizers of the conference to give me an opportunity to say a few words. And I've been told to say something about the general approach of the Human Development and Capability Association, which has moved the society for a number of years and with increasing success. I think it's very important in this context to recollect again the leadership of Babu Haq and the human development movement that he was leading, making a departure from trying to judge the progress of countries in terms of GDP growth only, and instead of that looking at various aspects of human lives and see the expansion thereof, enhancement of these human features as being human development. And so the human development approach, of course, right from the beginning, began as a kind of dialectical way, as a contrast with the growth of inanimate objects of convenience with GDP measures, or just income with GNP measures. And instead of that, we look at how people's lives are being enhanced. Now, I think it's very important to emphasize that distinction still, because GDP remains still a big factor. At the same time, it's very important also to emphasize the connection between the two, because it's not the case that GDP has got nothing to do with human development, not the case at all. In fact, they're related. It's just that we can't judge ultimately by the progress of a country by what's happening to the GDP, but how it's affecting the lives of people. That's where the penny stops, as it were. And if you're looking at that, then we have to take into account the contribution that the growth of GDP can make to human development. In the case of the Human Development Index, it's a very rather vulgar and rather summary index, but widely used. So one of the three elements is, in fact, income. So there's a clear connection there. But on top of that, for anything like education, which is reflected in the HDI, healthcare, which is reflected in the life expectancy part of the HDI, and more generally in the human development approach, the enormity of information on which the human development approach concentrates. They all have connections with the resources that could be devoted. So we're interested in GDP, partly because GDP generates income of people and resources, partly also because it generates public revenue, and it actually has the creative role of making it easier for the government to spend money on those things that are needed in education, in healthcare, in social security, in having social safety nets generally, and so forth. So I think it's important to emphasize the connection too, and we also have to recognize why GDP growth itself may be sometimes quite important. I think I'll take the view that in the European attempt at austerity, and what I take to be a confusion between needing reform and needing austerity, something has been really lost. In the austerity, of course, just cuts down public services, and that, of course, is terrible from the point of view of what these public services provide, which has been such a big part of the European commitment since the 1940s onwards. But on top of that, of course, there's the Keynesian thing that as you cut the public expenditure, somebody's expenditure is other person's income. So it also has a drag effect on the economy that reduces economic growth. Generally, Europe has been having pretty negative growth rate over the last few years, continuing even into the last year. Even in the first quarter of this year, 2012, if you leave out Germany, the overall expansion of the Eurozone has been negative. But with Germany, it's zero growth. And such has been the pessimism in Europe that when the zero growth was announced, that was taken as a good news because of the fact that there has been no growth for quite some time. But that's not a way of generating a better life for people. So I think it's as much a responsibility of human development people to emphasize the distinction on one side between human development and gross domestic product, but on the other side also to emphasize that gross domestic product and its growth also has importance of its own. So I think it's that general approach, bearing in mind what our ends are, human freedom, the life chances, as Mahbub Haq used to say, that people have, and equity in our life patterns, as well as being practical about the resources that are needed for it, and the commitment that can go with an upward-looking approach, whereby we don't want to cut everything down, but we want to expand things, and people's lives could be expanded. There's no reason to be constrained by a mere faulty organizational structure. It's not that we've been hit by a meteorite or something like that. It's just that we have created a mess for ourselves, and getting out of that is very important. And for poor countries too, high growth rate, not a bad thing at all. The question is, if we do manage to have high growth rate, the question then arises, are the resources generated being well used? I think, Tony, that's a good, I'm not sure it's good in quality, but at least good enough to get you started asking me questions.
Yes, indeed. Of course, I mean, what you said about austerity is something I've felt very much myself, and in my a year ago at the first Sen lecture, that was much of my theme.
Oh, indeed.
About,
brilliant lecture too.
But we mentioned Europe, but can I ask you about the same sort of issues with regard to countries like India and China, where it's, I think, still the case that we talk about them very much in terms of growth, GDP, and the other side of that equation, for example, we don't talk so much about what's happening to the Human Development Index, as it were, in the context of India. How can we somehow shift the public debate to say a bit more about...
I think again I would take a dual approach. Many Indians have got very depressed that the growth rate in India has come down. But it's really a bit of a storm in a teacup, because the growth rate has come down everywhere, even in China. India still is the second largest, second fastest growing large economy in the world, and some countries like Brazil, it's come down a lot more than that. But so 6.2, which was last year's growth rate, is not as much of a disaster and dismality as people make out to be. But I don't think that's really the tragedy, though at the same time I'm very much in favor of the government doing things which make higher growth possible. There's nothing wrong with that.